tell us a little bit about your history with the Ruby on Rails podcast.
Yeah, happy to. It's a complicated and weird one, so buckle up. The 5 by 5 Ruby on Rails podcast has been around for about 12 years. And so it's gone through the hands of a couple hosts. And at one point, Kyle Daigle, this was back in 2017, was hosting the show solo. And he decided that he was going to bring on a rotation of recurring co hosts. And so I must have been ambitious that day because I was like, at this point, I had been writing Ruby code for about 4 or 5 years. And so I reached out on Twitter and I was like, hey, I'm interested in joining as a recurring co-host. And Kyle was like, great, I'm going to bring you on. We recorded this great episode and then it didn't publish for 5 months. And I was like, oh no, the dream is over. And the reason, it was kind of wild. So I was like, okay, well, I did this thing. I could feel good about it. Good thing I didn't tell anybody about it, but just kind of went silent. And so as it turns out, Kyle was working at GitHub. I believe that was right around the time that Microsoft acquired GitHub. If I were to line up the timelines right, something was going on with Kyle. Kyle's great. He just, got really busy. And so then he came back, he's like, you know what, we're still going to publish this episode. I'm back. And I'm like, great. And so we started this recurring rotation. So every month or so I would come on, I would bring updates for Kyle and he and I would chat. I had a terrible microphone, terrible setup, but we made it work. And so he was editing it all and putting it out there. So I was very uninvolved other than just being on the show and producing content. Fast forward to 2018, Kyle got busy again. And I reached out to him and I said, hey, do you still want this podcast? Because I would be interested in taking it. And he's like, you know what? Sure. And he gave me the keys to the kingdom in 2018.
Nice.
So I took over. So I then became the main host of the 5 by 5 Ruby on Rails podcast. And then September 26th, 2018 was my first episode.
Wow.
And 200 episodes later, I'm still here, which is pretty cool. And then last year, I wanted to take the podcast independent. I wasn't sure how long the 5 by 5 network was going to be around. If you're not familiar with the 5 by 5 network, it was kind of like the NPR for nerds. And so just a lot of really fun shows. But at one point, it wasn't really Dan's main focus. Dan had built Fireside as a podcasting platform. And so I asked him if I could take the show independent. He was totally cool with it. And so I needed to come up with a real clever name for the new podcast. And I settled on the Ruby on Rails podcast because over the years, that's what everybody always called it. They always forgot the 5 by 5 part, which was kind of convenient. So you go with branding. Did I mention I used to be in marketing?
There you go.
So I took the podcast independent and it was rebranded, but I kind of stole from Kyle's idea because some of my very favorite podcasts, and I want to hear the podcast you two listen to, have recurring co-hosts. I like to hear those updates very much like the top of your show. And so I enlisted Brian Mariani, who is a recruiter at Knee Replacement. And those are my top listened to episodes. Everyone is obsessed with how Rails hiring is going, which is really fun. So I highly recommend talking to Brian if you need another guest on the show.
Oh, for sure.
Gemma Isroff, who is a developer on the C Ruby team at Shopify, and then Nick Schwaderer, who is also now on the Ruby infrastructure team at Shopify, but he's gone through several different roles over the years. And he was actually my first episode as a host of the show. And so he came on as co-host. So I rotate through those three, but then I also do a lot of interviews as well. I am very bent on bringing on people to the show who have never been on a podcast before. So usually at the top of the show, people are very nervous. They're like, what do I say? And I'm like, is this your first podcast? And they're like, yes. Should I keep that a secret? And I plead with them. I'm like, please say very early on the show that this is your first podcast, so people will be gentle on you. Speaking of, this is my first Twitch stream, so please be very gentle on me.
But you're doing great. I mean, you got the green screen and everything. You are pro.
Try to be a professional here, like if you're going to do it, you do it big.
That's right.
Can't go home, so you got to go big.
That's right. There you go.
So that's the history of the Ruby on Rails podcast. So I'm very appreciative that it's still going, and I appreciate every single listener that has hung in there through all the audio issues and me hiring an editor last year, which was the greatest decision of my life.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, 200 episodes. That's hanging in there.
Yeah.
I mean,
I've learned a lot of things.
We just topped 50, and that's it takes a lot out of you. Doing that stuff. It does,
but it's all about consistency, right? So you two have probably decided like we're gonna do this every Wednesday at 8:00 Eastern,
yep.
Rain or shine, this is gonna happen. And for me, it's almost the exact same pattern. Every Wednesday at 8:00 a.m. Eastern, I publish an episode.
Yeah.
And there are times that I have really brought it down to the wire to the point where listeners just have no idea that I'm recording on Tuesday night. Yeah. But I like to have a couple in the can just so that I can take a couple weeks to relax in between.
Yep. That is a little bit of a benefit of the pre-recorded stuff as opposed to the live stuff. We have to be sitting in this seat every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. And
there's stuff that, life happens. So that,
right.
And of course we take time off during holidays or certain things.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that. So my other podcast or show or whatever you want to call it, the Scaling Postgres, is at I just did the 223rd episode, but that is, I don't do any interviews. It's basically curating content. So I'd like to be able to have stuff in the can, but I don't know what I'm going to talk about until I look on the weekend what content's been generated. So there's no way for me to pre-prep stuff. So I feel like maybe we're doing this on hard mode. We're doing a live show for this one, and I have to wait for content to be produced for the second one.
I think you are doing this on hard mode, which probably means that you're ready for a podcast. It would probably be very easy for you going the reverse way in the content. But I hear you though, because there are times where I have a couple episodes recorded and then something really exciting happens. And I'm like, oh, shoot. Now it's going to have to wait a couple weeks until it gets out there. And there are times that I will shuffle episodes around just because I have a couple interviews in queue and they can wait. And if something really exciting happens, you don't want to put out content there that's going to expire very quickly. You know, you just don't know. And I think there's been a lot of exciting stuff happening within the Ruby community lately.
Yeah, there has. And timeliness is important. I mean, if you've got regular viewers or listeners, they want the tea, man. I mean, they got to have it. So, so I get that. And it's kind of the same for us. I mean, a lot of times at the end of our shows, we'll tell you what's coming next week. Most of the time, we don't know yet what's coming next week. So it's going to be a mystery show because we have to wait and see what happens during the week to say, okay, this will be a good topic,
Well, but that's still on us that just things get so busy.
Yeah.
And what are we going to do to come up with, because I mean, we need to. Yeah.
So I fell into this really weird trap and I refuse to get out of it. And I'd love your take on it. So for the entire history of the Ruby on Rails podcast, at the very top of the episode, we have always said this is episode and then the number. Do you know how many times that has bitten me in the foot? Because I will decide that it is, that it's going to be this episode number, as we go to record it. And then I, shuffle those episodes around. And so then what I end up having to do is to, splice out the, this is episode 427 and I'm your co-host, Brittany Martin. And I have to take that and swap it out in different episodes. And when I say me, I mean my editor. So I really try to be consistent. And you think that if I just cut that line out and didn't have an episode number, then, it would make things easier, but it's tradition. And I feel like I have to do it. So
yeah, well, I'm kind of glad we didn't start that tradition. We just put a date on it.
Yeah. So I recommend not doing that. Date's the way to go.
Well, yeah.
Now, is it ever fun for you to name the episode?
We do. I mean, I put a title on there, but I'm usually doing that the morning that we're going to, Wednesday mornings, I'll put the thumbnails together. and that's where I title the episode, and then I put the titles in for Twitch and YouTube. But I don't decide on a title until that morning, because sometimes we have changed what we're going to talk about kind of at the last minute.
Okay.
So I don't want to get too
like last week.
like last week. So I don't want to get too far ahead, and it only takes 5 minutes to generate thumbnails and stuff. So there's no reason to rush it, but yeah, and then I can just put a date on it and the title of the episode and be done with it. Plus, I don't have to remember numbers, because if it's higher than 10,
Well, here's a dark secret in case you haven't checked, because I actually run the website and publish to the podcast. And so Chris basically does the live component, and I do kind of like the after show prep, and I convert everything to episode numbers. Because that's
There
what the
you go.
podcasts want. And,
Yeah.
when you're publishing it, so I'm like, okay, well, this is like, we're about to hit our 50th episode. What I like about that is that you can more easily celebrate the wins or the successes that, hey, we're about to publish like next, where's this episode? I can't even remember now. Like, is this episode 50 or not? I can't even remember.
That's
now.
why I don't pay attention to that. I can't remember.
If you like this clip and want to watch another one, you can click right here. Or if you want to watch the full video, you can click here.